Hello, bonjour, tanche, bonjour. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. My name is Noe Prefontaine, and I'm an education program coordinator with the NCTR. Before I turn it over to our honored speakers today, I'll share some quick housekeeping notes. First, there will be simultaneous translation into French available throughout the conversation. To access this, you need to switch to the French channel, which is under the globe called Interpretation. Il y aura une traduction simultanée en français sous le bouton appelé Interprétation. Vous pouvez trouver ce bouton sous le globe ou peut-être dans les 3 points appelés More. Pour le français, s'il vous plaît, changez la chaîne maintenant. We are pleased to be partnering with Shapeshifter for our tech supports this year, and they will be adding ASL interpretation to the videos afterwards. So you should be able to find that on our YouTube channel in the coming week or so. For the moment, we do have the option of Zoom auto-generated closed captioning. This is also webinar setup, which means that cameras, microphones, and the chat function are not enabled. You may, however, and we encourage you to use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and our speakers will leave about 10 minutes to address some of them towards the end. There's a great number of people today. I'm already seeing 1.7K of us here. So that means that only a few questions can get answered. If your question is not answered and you're burning to get it answered, you can submit it to the email that contained the Zoom links to this webinar. We expect that all questions will be asked with respect. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is located in Treaty 1 territory, which is the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Inninawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Dene, and the Red River Métis. We are located in a province that sources water from dams on the mighty river systems of the North and Treaty 5 and drink water that comes from Treaty 3. For all of us joining from across Turtle Island, I invite you to take a silent moment to consider the First Peoples whose lands these have always been and always will be, with or without regard for treaty agreements. As we're entering today's discussion, I invite you to open your minds, hearts, and spirits that we may speak truth, hear truth, and move forward together in better paths. It is now my distinct honor to introduce today's speakers and moderators. We have with us today Ry Moran, Dr. Marie Wilson, and moderator Connie Walker. And so I now gratefully pass it off to you, Connie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noe. I really appreciate that introduction. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I have to say, it's so nice to see the warm welcome that we're getting in the form of all of the heart emojis and thumbs up. And thank you very much. I feel everything that you guys are portraying with those emojis. And so honored to be here today to talk to Ry and Marie. For those of you who don't know me, I am a Cree journalist from a member of the Okanese First Nation from Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan, but I also have roots in Treaty 6. And I am just, so thrilled to be a part of this conversation and to hear and continue to learn from both Marie and Ry. And I feel like we're all so lucky that they have joined us today. I would like to invite them to introduce themselves, and maybe Marie, we can start with you.
Thanks very much, and hello to everyone. I just recently learned that there's such a thing as emoji guilt. So just so you know, all these beautiful emojis are making me wonder, do I use my emojis correctly? I am originally from southwestern Ontario. I was born and raised close to the community now properly recognized as Anchenong near Sarnia, Ontario. I have lived for the past many, many years in the Northwest Territories in Denendeh. We reside in Yellowknife, my family and I, on Treaty 8 territory, the Williday peoples of Cheat Dragi's territory of the Dene Nation. And my husband and my family ties are to Treaty 11, Radelikon, Fort Good Hope. So I'm really grateful to be here with you today, and I feel that I've had the great honor of visiting so many of your homelands over the years of the Commission.
Great. Yeah, and my name is Ry Moran. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded Algonquin territories. I'm in Ottawa right now, but I don't live here. I'm just traveling out here for some dialogues on reconciliation, actually, that are happening as part of this whole month of September that we're sharing across the country. I'm a Red River Métis person that did grow up mostly out west, but had the great privilege of being in Winnipeg, serving with the TRC, with Marie, and then with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation for over a decade, where I raised my family. And I live now in Wasanic territories, Lekwungen territories in Victoria, British Columbia, and I work at the University of Victoria now. Such an honor to be here to just share some thoughts and experiences with you all, and what a privilege it is to be with Marie and Connie today as well.
Thank you both. I look back so fondly at the TRC events that I was able to attend, in particular the final event in Ottawa. And I think there are probably people who are in the audience today who may not have had a chance to attend a TRC event, who didn't get to kind of experience the warmth and the energy that often accompanied those events. But I wonder if I could ask you both to just reflect back on if there's a memory from one of the events or from one of the community gatherings that you also went to, that you could share with our audience who may not have had a chance to experience it in person. Marie, would you like to start?
Yeah, and I don't know if I can narrow it to one, but I'll try to be quick with three. And the first is, I have to say, the memory of my first encounter and our first encounter as a commission team. It was such a great honor to work with now the late Murray Sinclair, our chair, the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair, so many titles, and a beloved friend and grandfather, and my commissioner colleague, Chief Wilton Littlechild. And I just remember the exhilaration, that would be the right word, the first time we met, thinking something big is going to happen here, and just realizing from that first moment what an honor it was to be part of it. The second thing I would quickly go to is a front end of when we first had our very first big public event, and it was in Winnipeg. And you've touched on it actually in our preparatory conversations, Connie. When we had our first circle of reconciliation, and I concluded at the end by saying, I see you, I hear you, I believe you, and I love you. And then being overwhelmed by the lineup of people who came forward and said variations of, I've been waiting my whole life to hear those words, that someone sees me and believes me. And that was, it just underscored what my heart already knew, which was that this was going to be profoundly sacred work and spiritual work, because I didn't choose those words. They just were the words that were given to me in the moment. And it was a good reminder that I could also trust myself to just be fully present and see what was going to come to us. And if I may just quickly say, the other big reminder I have actually is at the back end, when we were having our closing events in Ottawa. And it makes me think of that today, because on one of we had themes for each of a 4-day event there. And I remember the theme for day 4, which was, this ending is just the beginning. Mm-hmm. And here we are 10 years later, mm-hmm. keeping that very message alive and saying, yes, it is even today still the beginning, but we are still beginning and carrying on and trying to do good things, including this important conversation with so many people who have joined us. It's fantastic.
Thank you, Marie.
Yeah, those are really beautiful memories, and I'll perhaps do the same thing as just talk about the start and the end of the commission, but of course we're still in this ongoing work and shared journey together. But I think back to the Winnipeg National event, which was held in 2010, and that event was held at the Forks in Winnipeg, and it started with the lighting of a very important fires that we would see lit across the country as each one of the national events was held. And when that fire was lit, it was held with the teaching of respect, and actually that entire theme of the event was about respect. And And when we got to the end of the commission, of course, we heard that reconciliation is about the establishment and maintenance of mutually respectful relationships. That's still the work that we're all involved with today, is achieving those respectful relationships and striving hard for those to materialize. Now, we can talk about reconciliation, but we of course have to talk about the truth as well. And that also makes me think about the statement gathering work that we did at that Winnipeg National event, the first really major time in this country's history that we were willing to listen fully to what survivors had to share. And I very distinctly remember coming into that event quickly. It was a lot of work getting that all prepared, arriving very early on site that first day with our teams, and there being a huge lineup of survivors that were waiting to speak with us.
Was
And
that surprising? Sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
Were you expecting that?
we didn't know, to tell you the truth, Connie. Like,
Mm.
we just didn't know. We didn't know a lot at the beginning. We had a sense of what we needed to do. We had a vision, thanks to the commissioners and the survivors that were around us, but we really didn't know what the uptake was going to be like. We just knew that we had to be prepared. And all of a sudden we had this huge lineup. We were welcoming people into the rooms. There was a lot of kind of hustle and bustle and even a little bit of chaos. And it was kind of stressful. But, by about 11 o'clock that morning or so, I was walking down the hallway where all these statements were being recorded. And it was, despite how hard the stories were that were being shared and the experiences that were being shared, there was also this simultaneous sense of peace and calm at the same time. And it really struck me as being this profound example of how, if we do things with the right heart and right mind and take the care with steps and things that we need to do, that even if we're talking about something so unbelievably hard, it can still be done in a good way, and it can still be done in a safe way. And I just have so much gratitude for all of those survivors that were willing to trust us as the commission and have maintained that trust today, to steward these sacred stories that were shared with us on that day and in so many other events across the country.
I if
Can I just jump in, Connie, because I want to clarify something that Ry just said, something really important, and I think because he was introduced in his role of having established the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which was a vitally important role. But at that time, he was the director in charge of statement gathering, among other things, but that was a big part of his role. So the perspective that he's bringing to it is very relevant to that. And Ry, I have a memory from that event too. I remember you coming down the hallway and saying at one point, unbelievable, one of those statements was 7 hours long, because we tried to allow for survivors to speak in a variety of ways. As Ry said, not knowing what was coming, not knowing with certainty what people's needs would be, but also, in a way, not knowing whether what we had in mind would work. There was no precedent for what we were doing, or indeed for our kind of commission. And so we were trying to guess at the right answer, if I can put it that way. And I sometimes say we were trying to design the bus, build the bus, and drive the bus all at the same time. And so that kind of private statement gathering that Ry is referring to was complemented by survivor sharing circles, which were a different format, and then what we called commissioners sharing panels, which were wide open to the public and the media, which was a different format. And people chose where they wanted to place themselves, depending on what they felt ready for, what they had to share, the ability for that to be public or needing to be private. But it was all guessing at the right answer and trying to, hoping that we had foreseen for all the needs, and very importantly, adjusting as we went along, adjusting as we got more certain of what might be coming.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're doing that, when you're trying to build the bus and drive the bus at the same time, like what do you think contributed to the success, like to the safety that survivors felt in order to be able to share? Like, what were some of those kind of guiding principles the commission adopted that ensured that was going to work?
I guess if I can speak to my own role in that, or my own perspective, um, this this was always about relationships and about creating a safe space for people to share whatever it was that they wanted to share, um, by their own choosing, and creating as much choice around that and agency around that as possible. So, in the language, out of the language, choosing whom they wanted to share it with, the format, the location. But with all of that choice, there was this undergirding principle too. And what I used to say to our teams, as much as I could, was, I hope you invite the person into your space that you create as you would invite your own grandmother, and you treat that person with the same care, with the same love, with the same heart that you would inviting a very cherished family member in that you hold in very high esteem. And that was what we tried to do, tried to achieve that. And it remains my hope to this day that we succeeded in doing that, because I think that puts the human into this relationship that we were trying to create, and try to put that principle of care, real sincere, real
Mm-hmm.
heartfelt, tangible care for the people that we were speaking to at the center of the circle.
The
I think
survivors.
that, and yes, and I think that point of relationship is, it can't be overstated, because um, Ry and I, for example, did not know each other. We had never met before the commission. Murray and Willie and I knew of each other, but we did not know each other. We had never worked together before. We didn't know each other in any kind of deep way. So part of the ongoing effort too, which we were not perfect at, but we were consciously trying to do, was uh, to demonstrate and to live the kind of reconciliation we were asking everyone else to step into, and to be respectful in our own dealings with each other, and with all those with whom we had encounter. We tried really hard to be the reconciliation we were seeking, as it were.
Mhm.
I know we've talked a lot, and probably people have heard a lot this week about it being 10 years since the final event in Ottawa, and 10 years since the final report was released. I'm wondering if you can kind of situate yourselves back in 2015 and first talk about, you know, what expectations did you have around the impact of the work that you had at that point, spent 6 years, doing, and then also from this point looking back, how do you feel about the impact of the TRC, and the way that Canada has or has not embraced this work in the last 10 years? Big question.
Uh, Did you want me to go, or yeah, I don't want to
Yeah,
jump in.
go ahead,
Sure.
Ry. Yeah.
Yeah. There was so much that happened at that closing event in Ottawa. And if we stick just with this theme of statement gathering for a second, one of the things that I think is important to remember is that we were still very much recording statements at that closing event, both sharing circles and public statements. And that says that even though the commission reached the end of its journey, the truth telling aspect of the broad work of truth and reconciliation was still very much ongoing. In fact, it was still just starting in many ways, because as we've been going along, um, there are people who have been able to, or willing to, or provided the opportunity, or have the space, have reached the point in healing where they're able to talk. And that continues right up to this very, very day. We're still learning to this very moment, and will continue to learn what the history and impact of those residential schools are, and continues to be. So I think that's a big part about the closing event. The other part is just, you know there was so much spontaneity to the event as well, that was just kind of magical, and again uncertain, and also amazing when it happened, because again, at least when I was going into it, we didn't really know, who was going to show up, and there was a large walk for reconciliation that was planned, the day before from the
Sunday.
Gatineau's, Sunday, and down to City Hall in Ottawa. And I was walking kind of mid walk, I guess. I was walking with a couple of survivor friends that I had, and there was a moment as we came around the corner onto Wellington Street, and all of a sudden, there was another group that sort of joined in from the side, and then there was more people that came in from the back, and all of a sudden I was looking forward, and it was people as far as I could see, and I looked back, and it was people as far as I could see backwards. And surrounding me were these beautiful signs like, we're in this together. It's time for hope. We shall overcome, that type of sentiment. And as we walked down towards City Hall, what did we see? At the stage where survivors and the commissioners, of course, were speaking, these large signs the TRC had, it's time for hope. And that sense, that commitment to maintaining the belief and the knowledge that we can overcome this terrible aspect of our shared history, and that we can create a Canada that is safe for all peoples, especially Indigenous peoples, is not just a hope, but it's a very firm conviction of mine that it was made that much stronger, my belief in that ability, by virtue of that event, and by virtue of the courageous vision that was shared by so many.
Reid, do you remember that? How what your from your vantage point, the walk?
Well, I would say, and maybe because I'm just that much older than Ry, but for me, I don't think about the commission as starting with the commission.
Mhm.
I think about the story as being way longer than that, and it's way longer than I'm even going to reference. But I think about the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and they specifically talked about the issue of residential schools and that needing further exploration. I think about Willie Blackwater and the regional case that was brought forward in BC, and Liz Cloud in Southern Ontario, and Nora Bernard in the Maritimes, and all those people who were already taking things to the courts at great personal risk and cost in some cases,
Mhm.
and saying this was not right. And then seeing that come together in this massive class action, seeing the role that Phil Fontaine as the national chief played in galvanizing that. I was a journalist at the time, and I was in the room when he first disclosed, and it wasn't on air with Barbara Frum, it was in a session before that, which led to that interview. And seeing all of that, and then seeing the commission and finding myself part of the leadership of it, and then seeing the unfolding. So from that, and then seeing those who wrote that a mandate for the TRC, because let us not skip ahead to forget the fact that we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because survivors fought through the Canadian legal system, right up to the Supreme Court, to make it happen, taking on both the federal government and the four national churches named as having been those who operated the schools on contract to the government. That was survivor heroism, and that was courage before the courts. And that's why we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because they fought to have one, and they insisted that it be a term of the deal.
Mhm.
And all those other people who had built the momentum that kept on going. The momentum for me that gave greatest hope, to pick up on Ry's excellent word, and it's one that I cling to, is that they wrote a mandate that named the people of Canada.
Mhm.
It said the ongoing reconciliation involves, yes, the survivors and their families, the churches, and it named the government. It also specifically named the people of Canada. And so how many of the people of Canada, we're getting up to almost 3,000, am I reading that correctly?
Yeah.
People on this call. And we saw that same growth. That final closing event was after our seventh national event, and we had seen the shift from at Winnipeg, that first event where about 10% of those, some 40,000 people showed up, about 10% were non-Indigenous, and by the time we landed three and a half years later in Edmonton, 60% were non-Indigenous. It didn't mean fewer Indigenous people were involved. It meant that the momentum had grown and people were paying attention and people were stepping up. And so I think that movement, and to say that's what has to continue, that we don't think of it as a moment in time, but a long and still unfolding story, and that we're all in it, and we have to figure out what is our part to play.
Thank you so much for acknowledging that long history and explaining, what led to the work of the TRC. In terms of this kind of inclusion of Canadians in this work of reconciliation, how have you viewed, what seems to still be like a snowball effect every year? It feels like it somehow gets bigger and bigger. I remember last year, on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, taking my kid to an appointment in Toronto here, and just as a way to pass the time, we thought we would count the number of orange shirts that we saw. And it wasn't that long of a drive, but it was just every corner, almost everywhere we turned, there was another orange shirt. And it's anecdotal, but it really feels like this momentum is continuing to build and to grow. And I'd love to hear from you both about how you take that in, is because it is part of the work that you all did in the TRC with survivors.
Mm.
I'll jump in first on this one, and just to say, we owe a tremendous amount to Phyllis Webstad and the work that she has done to grow the important symbolism of the orange shirts. I think about, I sometimes say, when we think about Remembrance Day, we often also call it Poppy Day. It's good to have a symbol that all generations can grab onto and associate, and remember that in her case, it was the story of one child who had something treasured from home taken away from them. And almost every child of the almost 7,000 we heard from had a variation of that story of something treasured. And of course, the most treasured thing of all being the love bond with home. And so it's so much more than just a shirt. It is our devotion to and our potential to betray the children in our midst. And how do we live up to the promise of saying we're not going to do that anymore, when we still have so many instances of where it is still happening under different titles? So I think that the challenge is for it not to be a one-day performative event, but for it to be really a day. It's not a day off for everybody to go fishing. We didn't ask for a national statutory holiday so everyone could have a sleep in and a barbecue. It was really meant for deep reflection and honoring, and recalling and learning for those who are still on the big learning track, as we all are, as we have, we all have stories that we have not yet heard. And that is what we need to do. And then we need to say, what do we do with that? How do we breathe life into that beyond a particular day?
Mm. Yeah, and I think just from my own observation along the way is I have so much gratitude for this journey, both having had the privilege, the incredible privilege, and the opportunity to have served for something as perhaps noble as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the NCTR, and I think, as Maurice has so eloquently said too, is that when you enter into this type of commitment to the work, it's a lifelong commitment. It's never a job. It couldn't ever be that. You have to really believe deeply in how important this work is. In that, what am I thankful for, and who am I thankful for? Well, I am extremely thankful for the survivors that we've already talked about in this meeting, as having had a vision and the courage and the fortitude to create the space that is necessary in Canadian society so that the truth could emerge and that Canada could understand what has happened. And I think we should remember that was very, very difficult, that was hard fought for. And the words that were shared oftentimes were shared through tears and through pain and through great deal of personal anguish. And, we were witness to that at the TRC, but it was done with an incredible amount of strength and resilience and determination to live into this practice of saying never again will we let this occur. And to that end, I'm extremely grateful for this very moment that we're sharing right now too. I mean, for all of you that are listening right now, I mean, it's like just from me to you, thank you for being here, because everybody had somewhere else to be today. Everybody lives busy lives. There's things that are going on. There's multiple pressures that we have on us, and you chose to opt into this conversation, and that matters. And if we keep opting into this, it will change this country. And if next time this conversation, this opportunity comes up, you maybe bring one more person or one more person still, and we keep having this dialogue and keep remembering what's at stake when we talk about the future of Canada and the history of Canada and the healing that's needed. We will get through this. We can overcome. And I'm just so thankful that I've been able to witness so many powerful and exceptional visions for what this country can and should be through all of the courageous words that have been shared.
I just want to remind people that the final report is available for everyone to look at, and that even 10 years out, there are still things that I am learning from it, and that there's so much knowledge and information, but also I think guidelines in terms of engaging in this work. And I know there's a lot of emphasis, or there has been a lot of emphasis on the calls to action. But the TRC also provided frameworks, like a framework in terms of principles of reconciliation. Marie, I wonder if you could tell us why that was included, and your thoughts on how those principles of reconciliation have been, the impact they've had in the last 10 years.
Well, I talked earlier on in our conversation here about us trying in a constantly renewing way to model the kind of reconciliation we were calling for in our relationships with each other and outwardly. And that's about how. That's when you raise the question of reconciliation. If I were to put it this way, I would say the calls to action really kind of focus in on all of the areas that need work, which is kind of the what, and it's guiding, but it's not prescriptive, because we know the reality in every context is different and is very diverse. The potential is different. The resources available is different. The lived experiences are different, depending on time and location. But it doesn't address in that good old journalistic way of, that's the what is the how? What is the how? And really the principles of reconciliation are trying to address that, so that it doesn't become a to-do list, but it becomes a new way of being in relationship with each other. It becomes a new way of, for example, the principles that we talk about, which acknowledge expertise that isn't all Western trained, Western learned, Western imported. It isn't all from somewhere else, as presented and taught and absorbed by somebody else. It's also the kind of wisdom and knowledge and proven expertise that has sustained societies for millennia. That has value, and how do we bring that forward in a positive way to recognize we're meant to live in balance. We're meant to live in balance in our relationships with each other and with all of creation. And our track record is that we have not done that. So how do we rebalance in all regards? Both materially and physically, and from a point of view of opportunity, from a point of view of access to resources, and from the point of view of presumptions about who knows what, and who knows anything, and who knows best. And how does knowledge evolve? Because knowledge itself is not locked in time. It's not an old dusty thing. It's a constantly evolving thing that depends on being able to read where you are and what's going on around you. So that's why we drafted the principles of reconciliation, and we also said that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the first and foremost of those principles, which talks about identity as not just being it definitely not being a kind of color-based or race-based thing, but a relationship-based identity with lands. That's why we do land acknowledgements, and people's identity so tied to place and um, um, where their lifeblood lies and has come from over the millennia. So I may have lost the actual sharp point of your question, but I think about those two things going together. Oh, the other thing I did just want to add, Connie, is that in the calls to action, we were very aware, even at the time. I mean, it's such an odd number. How did you come up with 94? Well, because that's kind of when we ran out of time and ran out of gas. You know, in part, it's that. I don't want to be frivolous about it, but there was nothing magical about that number. But we also, with more time and reflection, might have come up with others, might have sharpened the wording on some of those,
Yeah.
might have been there might have been more sub bullets, whatever. But we've always said it's not meant to be an exclusive list. And so that's why the principles and the calls to action are good companion documents, because if you're living in the spirit of reconciliation that the principles tell us about, you may come up with other ideas that are beyond the 94, that are completely excellent ideas or that we didn't label as such. And I have seen examples of those kinds of things that are going on, and that also are a blending of many calls to action. So we don't want people to be narrowed down in their thinking, but rather to be prodded into big-hearted thinking about what all else could be done.
Well, I'm curious, Marie, if there are other calls to action that you would add at this point. But before I'll let you think about that, and maybe we can hear from Ry in terms of what your thoughts are on the principles of reconciliation.
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things just immediately come to mind. One, when we talk about something like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we can think about some of the very last articles that are in that and some of the actual really important preambular statements. So let's start with the preambular statements. Welcoming the fact that Indigenous peoples are organizing themselves socially, culturally, and politically to end all forms of racism and oppression, no matter where they occur. What a powerful and beautiful statement, and what an incredible vision for the future of this country and for the world, because this is not just about Canada. This is about how we live together as humans all over the planet and how we're in relationship with the land as well. Towards the end, the articles constituted herein constitute the minimum standard for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. So what that means is that we have to remember that we have to establish a new floor of understanding for what it takes to live together respectfully here in Canada and world over, and that the inherent and inalienable human rights that Indigenous peoples have can and must be recognized as a precursor to starting the conversation on reconciliation. Once we have those rights recognized as being present and in the room, then the ceiling is amazing. You know, we're still talking about the very foundation upon which we have to base this conversation on, because we can't have a conversation about reconciliation without talking about fundamental human rights that have been systematically violated through things such as the residential schools, forced relocation of Indigenous peoples, the list goes on, and the need to move deliberately, consciously, and as quickly as possible away from that past broken history. And I think that's always really important for us to remember, is that we still have hard work to do in this country around protecting and affirming those human rights as being the floor to the conversation. And that is something that we're all really called upon to do, to understand and articulate what human rights are and how they're a solution to the problems that have been plaguing us. They prevent us from doing further harm in the future. And that's what this is all about. It's about stopping the harm and building better futures together.
Maria, I'm wondering if you could speak to the progress in terms of the adoption of the calls to action, or maybe the lack of progress in terms of how governments and then I guess Canadians are responding to the principles of reconciliation and the calls to action, and if there are any that you wish would have also been included, back then.
So, that's a three-part question, right? So, I'm going to add a fourth part because I actually want to pick up on something that Ry just said. First of all, I do very particularly want to honor my colleague, Chief Dr. Wilton Littlechild, as one of the people who was an architect of that UN declaration and worked on it for decades and was hard at it long before he ever became a TRC commissioner, and was very essential in guiding those elements of our work, many elements of it, but in particular, he was the expert on the international perspectives, and we owe him a great debt for that and proper recognition. The other thing to say in the UN Declaration is it's one of the things that it also points out. And why does it point it out? Because we seem not to know that. It points out that the whole point of the declaration is not to say that Indigenous people should have more than somebody else, but rather to point out the fact that they have not had what everyone else has taken as something for granted, human rights that are universally accepted. And I think we have to stop living the contradictions, where we say as a nation state that we believe in one thing, but then because we had signed on to the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and we were still operating residential schools that were denying and depriving human rights and allowing for extraordinary and sometimes criminal abuses to take place. So we have to stop living the contradiction. What is beautiful about this moment is that we can no longer say, well, we didn't know that. We hadn't put those pieces together. I hope that one of the lasting legacies of the TRC is that it has helped people, and that those calls to action indeed help connect the dots between the legacy of how things are and have been and the reconciliation section of our calls to action, which are how things could yet be and should become in the direction that we should be heading. So to the other part of your question, one of the things that we were intentional about is calls to action 53 to 56 that call for a National Council for Reconciliation, so that there is an agency that isn't me that can say, how are we doing, and how are we doing on that reconciliation front and the fulfillment, not just the fulfillment of calls to action, but the hoped for outcomes of those calls to action, which is closing the gaps in so many measurable ways, where so often Indigenous peoples in Canada are in the negative side of the statistics. And if we don't, we count what counts. That's the bottom line. What do we count? We count what counts. So if we actually say these things count now that we know, then we have to start counting them and holding them up and saying, are we getting better? Are we not? Are we making progress, or are we not? Are we on the right path, or are we not? Is it getting better here but getting worse there? What can we learn? How can we share the learnings? And how can we celebrate those things that are happening that are fantastic? So you asked for an example. Let me just share a recent one. I was in a community in BC. It was a public event. There were 450 or 500 people on a Saturday night, if you can imagine, who showed up. And half of the place there, that I'm going by eyeball, but approximately half of the place, and I was signing books, so I'm also going by who showed up at the table and how people identified themselves, were non-Indigenous people. And this is a community that's actually facing some, tense questions about a certain aspect of its nature right now. But there they all were coming together. And every element of that gathering was done by young Indigenous emerging leaders. Everything from the opening protocols to the emceeing to the prayer in language to a song that had been written for the purpose to the dressing of the stage, which had little chairs to remind us all of the little ones who never came home, that was dressed so beautifully, to orange toned flowers of all sorts all across the stage. I mean, I walked in and I almost burst into tears, just to in a good way, just the sight of it, the intentional care, which could only come from depth of understanding and depth of commitment. Now, that's just one example. I could tell you one other quick one. I don't want to monopolize all the time, but an initiative in the judiciary. So I cite that one because that's not a specific call to action, the one I just told you about. But it is about language revitalization. It is about creating space for young people. Those each have calls to action in there. It is about ongoing learning. It is about creating opportunity for collaborative engagement and educational opportunity. Like, it was a whole bunch of things. So would you tick that as one box or multiple boxes, or it's just that one community, so it's not really, you know what I mean? I think we limit ourselves if we think we have to have a narrow interpretation. We have to look around and see what's happening and see what is yet to be done. And I was just going to quickly tell you an example that I know of in the judiciary, where an intentional effort was made to mentor Indigenous lawyers into potential eventual roles on the bench. And all I want to say about it in shorthand is that the biggest learning of it all was that the judges who were the mentors were reporting back that they were learning as much or more from their mentees as the other way around. So if you create relationship, I think we have to move way beyond this notion of this is the ongoing national obligation to this is the ongoing national gift and enrichment, because these encounters are, if they are done with good heart, they are enriching to everyone involved. And I really firmly believe in that. And those two little examples are just recent examples that I've lived through that I wanted to share with you.
Thank you for sharing those. Thank you. I appreciate it. One of the things that you talked about earlier, Ry, was the ongoing truth telling that has happened since the end of the TRC. I think, as a journalist, I think so much of my work has also been, I think, trying to more fully understand the truth of what happened in residential schools, but also the ongoing impacts in our families and communities. And I'm curious, how you think this work, or how you think of the work of the ongoing trying to expose and understand the broader truths of Indian residential schools. Because I think for some people, they may have thought, okay, the TRC has found out the truth, so let's check that and let's move on to reconciliation.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really important question, and I think, if anything, over the last number of years, we've heard the phrase "truth before reconciliation" sound very, very loudly in this country, especially in light of the confirmation of unmarked burials at various residential schools across the country. And I think, when we take a step back and look at even how the commission itself was set up and what the drafters of the settlement agreement aspired to, is they understood, and this is actually going back to Marie's earlier point, all the way back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and even further back than that, there has always been the recognition that this truth-telling work would take years, generations, centuries, really, in Canada. And that's the very reason why we have a place like the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, the very reason why the Commission was tasked with gathering statements and documents from church and government archives, and why all of that work remains ongoing to this day, is because it's actually getting people into those records, communities, survivors themselves, family members, journalists, artists, musicians, into these records so that we can continue to learn from what has happened and that we can continue to ask more questions. We're seeing the fruits of that work now, even simple things that I take a step back and, for example, look at one of the first sets of records that we released at the NCTR when I was there were these things called school narratives. Now, we had to fight very, very hard to get those in the very first place at the TRC. That was a knockdown, fight at early days to wrestle those from the government of Canada. Now I'm seeing those appear in lots of articles that are being written as being a foundational sort of source of just orientation to then begin to ask different questions. That's showing us how, information is a series of chain links that we build sort of over time. We're also not out of the woods in regards to truth telling. Connie, you and I have talked about this a lot in the past that, in 2027, there's going to be a very significant and sizable body of truth and evidence that is slated for destruction in this country. And we know also, in addition to that, that nations themselves are still having trouble accessing records from various sources for a whole bunch of different reasons.
Right, I'm just noticing all of the emojis changing, which maybe do you want some people? I find that a lot of people don't know that this is about to happen in September of 2027. So I wonder if you could quickly.
I'm sorry we're so late in the talk to get to this, and I'm sorry for the emoji reactions here if I've caused any shock. But the brief story is that the line to the present right now has been rocky in regards to how difficult it's been to preserve the truth. The TRC started court actions in 2012, and there was a series of actions. One of the next steps that came along was an effort to ask questions about what would happen with the records from the independent assessment process. And for those of you that are or are not aware of that process that sort of ran parallel to the TRC and had a different truth-telling aspect and mandate to it. It's those records from that particular process that are now slated for destruction in 2027. Now, one good thing to know is there is information online, both through the NCTR and through other sources, that give survivors themselves the opportunity to preserve their records if they wish, to get a copy for themselves, to deposit it in an archive. But en masse, even, say the decisions that were issued by adjudicators in that process that would, give evidence of what occurred, unfortunately, are slated for destruction after that case went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada and sort of backed down. So it's
just to also point out, I think the last time we checked that, for the IAP records, I think only 27 survivors had opted in at that point to have their records preserved. And I think that speaks to, maybe the lack of awareness that survivors, don't necessarily know that this is happening to their records, to the truths that they shared. And I think the other unfortunate reality is that, we have lost a lot of survivors who may have participated. I think the number is somewhere around 38,000 who filed applications for the TRC.
Correct. Yeah, those are the exact right numbers, Connie. And I think it's one of these things where, when we talk about something like this, it tells us that our progress, be it through the calls to action, through the principles of reconciliation, or even through our truth preservation efforts, is not a straight line. It's kind of lurching. We're kind of stumbling at times, even as a country. And it is important that's all the more reason why it's important that we do continue to keep this fire burning and to keep this conversation going, because it's there are no guarantees, but within that is also the recognition and the firm belief that together and collectively we can confront these situations with a clear-eyed vision to the future and navigate some of these stumbles that happen along the way through information sharing, and through ongoing dialogue.
I'm going to jump in on this one, Connie, because it's such an important issue. And one of the things that we often heard during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because people who chose to be were involved in both processes, those parallel processes. But the IAP, just so people understand, um, that was financial compensation that had nothing to do with what the TRC's core work was, which was more educational and preservation and inspirational, if I can put it that way. But it was to really deal with those kinds of abuses that went beyond the general harms that the courts had recognized as separation from family and community and loved ones and familiarity, and the disruption, the general disruption, which was a common harm to everybody who went to residential school. This was for those who felt above and beyond those general harms. They also had experienced specific further harms of whatever nature, and the nature ranged psychological, emotional, sexual, and many people talked about spiritual abuse, but that probably didn't make big headway in the IAP process. The reason I mentioned that is because many people came to us and said they weren't going to tell their full story to the TRC because they were waiting for their IAP hearing, and they didn't want to go through it twice because it was so difficult to talk about some of the most extreme things that they had lived through, and that was necessary in the process of the IAP because it was adjudicated. Or some people would say, I already did my IAP presentation, I don't want to go through it again. The relevance of that is that we run the risk of not having a record of the worst of what happened in our country, the true most devastating. We have the general story and absolutely rock solid there with such a common repetition of storyline, but those dire things that we need to be held accountable for as a country, that could disappear. And that's the great harm. And I do think it's really important to, and Ry knows this full well, the intention was never to expose or blow people's identity, but rather to be bound by all the laws around anonymity and safeguarding identities and such. So it's not about that. It's about knowing the substance of what happened so that we are truthfully honest about our history.
Mm-hmm.
I did just see a question in the Q&A. Somebody's saying that their Cookham provided their testimony through the IAP, but she has since passed away. And the question is, can families preserve the records for their loved ones who have passed on? But my understanding is no. Do you have a different understanding, Ryan?
Unfortunately, that is the way the court landed on this one. Was that it was the survivor's choice and the survivor's choice alone to make. And I think for those that feel uncomfortable with that, I'll say this. There were some very passionate arguments made on behalf of survivors to protect their own personal information, and that has to be appreciated. There were also very, very passionate arguments that were made by a coalition of intergenerational survivors that talked about that very question. And what about the relationship between the collective right to know versus the individual rights to privacy? It's a very, very complicated and sensitive topic, this one. And, it's one of these ones where it's always hard to talk about it even because it's a very tough one. But unfortunately, to answer that specific question, it's up to the individual survivor as it sits right now. But if people have concerns about that, I seriously don't think it's too late to write somebody that's in a position of power. I mean, write your MP, write your your justices, whomever it may be. Talk to your chief and counsel, talk to your political leadership, to raise concerns about what it is that's happening. Because I do still believe that 2027 is close, but it's not here yet.
And I just want to really quickly add to say that intergenerational survivors can also make a statement to the TRC and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. That aspect of the TRC's work, they are continuing. So maybe some of that can be picked up and brought forward in statements from intergenerational survivors.
I can't believe the hour is up already. I knew this was going to happen, but it's such a shame. And I just want to thank you both so much for your generosity and your warmth and your kindness that you've shared with all of us today. It's so appreciated, and the work that you all did is just, we all owe you such a huge debt for taking on this really incredible, important work. And I'm just thrilled that I got to be part of this conversation today. So thank you.
You're part of the work too, Connie. Thank you, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Ry, for this truly important conversation. We're right at time. I wish I could share much more appreciation. As you can see, so many responses here in the chat and many expressions of gratitude as well that we'll pass on to you afterwards. I also want to thank for that message of hope today and thank our tech team with Shapeshifter and to our French interpreter. If anyone in attendance is feeling any need of support, we've shared some resources in the chat, which are specific to Indigenous folks. If you're not Indigenous and need support, we encourage you to have a look for resources in your area, or there's also the National 988 resource for anyone in crisis. Thank you so much to everyone for attending and sharing this. Please check out our other Lunch and Learns this week. Those will be available on YouTube after the fact, as well as these Zoom webinars. Thank you, and we'll see you all soon. Merci. Thank you, everyone.
Merci, Cho.